Just a few days ago, the sequel to the book Ready Player One, Ready Player Two, debuted. I was a huge fan of the first book, so I couldn't wait to check this one out. So let's talk about it. Ready Player 2 picks up right after the events of the first book and has Wade having to deal with his newfound fame and riches, some new technology that changes the game forever, as well as a new threat that actually threatens all of mankind. Now, if you've checked out the book, let me know what you thought about it down below in the comment section, or if you are a fan of the movie and just kind of want questions, let me know your thoughts on all of it down below in the comment section. The majority of this will be a spoiler-free review. At the very end of it, I will have a spoiler section. I will label that so you can watch this if you haven't checked out the book. One final thing before we get started, this video is brought to you by Audible. I'm someone that prefers to read with my ears, not my eyes, so I actually listened to the audiobook of Ready Player 2, read by Will Wheaton. You can download it for free if you sign up for a free trial of Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. I'm a huge Audible fan. I listen to over 50 books every single year from Audible, and you can get one for free for signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler, and they do have Ready Player 2. That is how I went through the book. With that said, let's get started. And I gotta be honest with you, I was not a big fan of this book. As much as I loved the first one, I actually re-listened to it over the past month in anticipation for this. And there were a lot of things about this book that, in the direction they took things, the way that it's structured, that I just do not think worked. And while there are a few clever ideas, there are some twists and turns I was like, that was clever. The majority of it was a big frustration that it just feels like he needed someone to guide him or be a little bit bolder in choosing to go in a different direction with it. With that said, let's get started talking about the good. And the best thing about this book is that it really does dig in deeper into the technology, and in doing so becomes more kind of true sci-fi. Some of the best sci-fi kind of explores interesting ideas. Like, I think of like Philip K. Dick. What he would do with a lot of his short stories is there was some interesting idea that he wanted to explore about the nature of reality and technology, and then he would craft a story to explore that. Now, this is nowhere near as classic, iconic as Philip K. Dick. He did Blade Runner, Total Recall, Paycheck. This is nowhere kind of classic like his stuff, but there are some of those kind of ideas in it where you go, oh, that's interesting. And it takes what it did with the first book and movie and the technology of the Oasis and all of that, and it's like, what if we went further with that? What are the implications of this if this played out? And in doing so, becomes a lot more full sci-fi as opposed to just pure escapism. And especially in the first 20% of the book, last 20% of the book, you get a bunch of these kind of ideas of what if this played out in real life? What would be some solutions of real problems in the world? What are some of the real problems we're facing that this technology could deal with? How would people think about it in light of the world established in the previous story? It digs into a lot of that. And there was a bunch of stuff I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's neat. Okay, I hadn't thought about that. Huh. I like that. Likewise, another thing it does well is that it is true to who these characters are. And when I say that, you've got a group of like 18-year-olds, like fresh out of high school, college age nerds that have spent their entire formative years studying the past and different personalities, different things about them, and then suddenly they're rich and famous and powerful and have control of this big, gigantic thing. And they're not necessarily going to make the best choices. They're not going to make the same choices. They're going to interpret certain things differently. Intention kind of comes with that. As I was kind of going through it, I was kind of like thinking through it. You know, I listened to a lot of music and watched a lot of Behind the Music, this VH1 special from like 20 years ago. And they pick bands and they go behind the music. And it always work out. You'd have the rise to fame and then the middle section would be about the downfall. And this kind of does that. If the first movie, the first book is the rise to fame, you start to get the downfall and the conflict getting into it as their different worldviews. Now that they're at the top of the world, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll play into it. And this kind of explores some of that with these characters of how they would respond to growing up a little bit, being older, being powerful. But that doesn't make you more mature. And the ones of them that are more mature respond better than some of them that are, they weren't mature in the first one. This is picking up right afterwards. They didn't get a sudden spurt of maturity. So I liked that it was true to the characters in that fashion. Another thing, of course, there's the nostalgia in here. That's a big part of what made Ready Player One famous, was the 80s, late 70s, early 90s nostalgia. So we do a lot of that, and it picks different things to kind of go into. And so some of the movies, big things that you might have felt were lacking from the first do make an appearance here. And so it's always kind of fun with that nerd culture sort of stuff that it goes into. And with the story, there were kind of 3 different moments where I was like, oh, whoa. There are 3 of those nice twists and turns. And there were some of those in the first one where you kind of piece together what's been going on. You're like, whoa. This one, after kind of the first thing is acquired, there's a meeting in it, without wanting to say too much, that's a total WTF moment. You're like, whoa! And then as you kind of get into the last section of it, the final 15, 20%, there's like kind of 2 different little twist turns that are like, that was well played right there. That was nicely done. And even kind of where it closes things out in the epilogue of what's kind of going on was a nice little touch. For some frustrations, many frustrations I had, I went, okay, that closes things out nicely. That's a nice little touch right there. But as I said at the beginning, I was pretty frustrated with this book for the most part. So let's move on to the bad. And honestly, I went into this book very skeptical. I was excited. I was hoping my skepticism was going to be wrong, but I was very suspicious of where they could take this particular story because of the nature of the first book, the first movie. It's designed to be a self-contained story. You don't get to the end of it and think, oh, well, this is what will happen next. There's not an obvious next journey. When you look at James Bond, it's really easy to think of how James Bond would have more adventures. Think Indiana Jones. You can think of all the other things he might go and track down. But the story itself for Ready Player One was the draw to it. There was a very specific quest, and then it was about what characters would be fun to go on that quest with them. So you get to the end of that story, and they've already won. They're already at the top of the world. There's nowhere else to go. So I wasn't sure where they were going to take it. And as you go into this, you realize that there's kind of 2 different things that make Ready Player One interesting. The first one is kind of this world that's kind of post-apocalyptic where people are obsessed with technology and they're obsessed with the past because the world that they're in is dying, and therefore they're living off the past, not heading towards any real future. So there's a world building there that's really interesting and good. And the other side to it is the 80s nostalgia, the pop culture stuff. And the first one merged so well, this quest involving the oasis and the pop culture with this dying world of why people are escaping into it. And it made for a very compelling, fun nostalgia trip. There was a real page turner, or ear turner in my case, as I listened to it. The problem you run into is that this quest part, there's not really anywhere else to go with this, but there's a lot more you can do with the world and the characters. So, as I mentioned before, in the beginning of it, there's a bunch of different stuff. They set up really interesting ideas about the technology, about the world, about these characters and their thoughts about the future of all of this. That's very interesting sci-fi technology stuff. And then at the end of it, the last 20%, they start kind of tying some of that together, some potential, very sci-fi sorts of ideas, themes. even ethical dilemmas, morality plays about technology, people, privacy. It has all of that in there. But if you're going to make a sequel to the first one, you have to have this quest and the nostalgia. So squished in the middle of this story, it just feels like they had to force in another Easter egg hunt with 80s nostalgia. And even the way I talked about the positives, the beginning, the end, some interesting ideas. And then there's this slog in the middle where they are on this quest for these 7 shards, and you just never leave it. And this leads to kind of all the problems in the book for me, or a lot. There's actually quite a few problems even beyond this, but it turns into a slog because it just kills the pacing, the flow of the story. The first book was a race between all these characters trying to track something down first. And so it covered like a year. So you'd go on a quest, and then it would pause to show his real life, his friendships, his dating life, and then the conspiracy with Sorrento. And then we would kind of go back into the adventure, another quest. And so it broke it up. So it moved at a nice brisk pace and had variety in it. The way this one's designed, kind of once we start going after the second shard, as they call it in this, you're just stuck in that. Like 60% of the book. Like you're just on quest, like very little variety. We're just going to one nostalgia place to the next nostalgia place to the next nostalgia place. And it just gets monotonous. You want to break from it, and it's exhausting. Something that was so fun about the original becomes exhausting because you never get an escape from it. So that's a problem. Just the pacing is all off. But just in general, the way it's also structured is it feels like the enemy, this one, instead of a race, it's a ticking clock. They only have so much time to collect these items because of the plot line that plays into it. And because of that, that's why they have to be stuck on this mission. And I just don't think it works as well as the race. It's not as interesting. It feels forced, like he knew, I have to have the nostalgia. I have to have us on a quest. And so it's kind of squished in there. And it's the least interesting stuff because there's actual ideas when it comes to the beginning and the end. This whole middle chunk, all those ideas, we're not really exploring it. It's just a way to create a threat for the characters rather than exploring the ideas. All of the idea exploration is at the beginning and the end. The middle, we just go off on more nostalgia. It feels like a rehash. It was very, very, very frustrating for me. Along these same lines, some of the characters that they bring back, totally forced. They didn't need to do it. That they just, once again, felt like, man, this character was popular in the first one. We got to have him back. And it has bad sequel written all over it, the way some of these characters return. Then when it comes to the big ideas explored and the new technology, where they go with this story gets unbelievably creepy and unsettling. And the story knows that. And so it ties into it of like trying to acknowledge how invasive some of this is of what happens and what plays out. But it doesn't change that you're like, this doesn't feel right. I don't like, even though it's a book, it's imaginary. Like, I don't feel like I should know this because these characters shouldn't know this, shouldn't be experiencing this. And it tries to resolve that in the end. And I don't think it doesn't do it very well. There's just a lot of built-in hypocrisy, and the ideas don't come together. It's like, oh, that's a really interesting idea to explore, but to tell this story and try and have a happy ending, or at least have a mostly happy ending and land the ship and everything, tries to force pieces together that do not work. And these ideas don't line up with the conclusion that they wanted to have for it. And so and I'll talk about this when we get to the spoiler part. This is what I really want to talk about, these ideas and what is revealed at the end of it, what's kind of been going on with all of these different people in different ways. That is frustrating. That's what I'll talk about in the spoilers. And finally, it felt to me an awful lot like the author was trying to appease his critics. There were a bunch of articles written and a bunch of comments that I saw on Twitter about how the first book, the first movie, was just catering way too much to white suburban males born in the 70s and 80s. And because of the types of pop culture that leaned into. And that's true. It does do that. I just don't accept that as a criticism. Not every book is written for everyone and the character that all this stuff is about. was a white suburban dude. So that would make a lot of sense. And I don't think it's true that only white suburban dudes enjoy this sort of pop culture like Back to the Future. But so that was a criticism. And so it felt like the author was sensitive to that and tried to overcorrect by building language into this one of criticizing a bunch of this stuff in a way that didn't seem nearly as prevalent in the first book and sounds a lot like Twitter in the year 2020. And so every time that they would go to a new one of these pop culture levels to reenact this stuff, one of the characters would stop to point out all the problematic things about John Hughes movies or Prince. And so much so that you get into starting to get towards the final act of the story. The clock is ticking. They are running out of time, heading into a major battle, and someone pauses to point out their issues with the whiteness of Tolkien. Literally, the clock is ticking. People are going to die, and they pause to criticize Tolkien in this sort of way that just, it felt out of place. And it was in a way that was just like, we're literally pausing in the middle of the ticking clock to point out your issues with a guy that was born 120 years ago. That's weird. And it doesn't serve the story. It feels like it serves the agenda or the guy trying to protect himself from criticisms being thrown his way. Real quick, before I give you my closing thoughts on this one, be sure to let me know what you thought down below, especially if you read the book. I want to hear from some other people. I haven't really heard from anyone about this one. I don't know if I'm off on alone as the critic of this one or if everyone agrees with me. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Also, remember, if you haven't listened to it or if you want a free audiobook, you can get a free audiobook of your choice, for example, Ready Player 2 or Ready Player 1 at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. Sign up for a free trial, you get a free audiobook. While there are some really interesting ideas in this book, especially about the technology, about this world and the consequences of it, the actual story that they chose to tell, and by having to try and do the sci-fi new stuff while having a new quest, it just does not come together. The pieces do not fit. It's frustrating. There's some very problematic ideas in here, and there's parts where it feels like the author's just trying to cover his tail from his critics. So unfortunately, I did not like the experience of going through this book. I got to give this one a thumbs down, unfortunately. With that said, I'm going to start talking about some specific spoilers, and if you haven't read the book, go ahead and leave. All right, so talking about spoilers, there were 3 moments that just kind of like, whoa, okay, that was some nice writing right there. That was a big turn. You caught my attention. First one was when they go to the first meeting and you realize that Anorak is the villain and that he's this AI that's come alive, and we're facing evil Holiday in the form of his character in here. That was a nice little moment. I was like, okay, all right, we're establishing a lot of stuff, but where exactly are we going? And I was like, whoa, okay, this got serious real fast. Nicely played. It's frustrating for me because after that scene, then it just kind of goes into this long slog of quest stuff that it wasn't very interesting to me until we get to like the very end and we come out of it. And then when you get to the moment where Parzival takes the fake shards, puts them together, hands it to Anorak, claiming it's the real thing. Anorak, being an immature bot and not being a super intelligent AI, grabs it without thinking about it. We realize that Parzival has kind of come up with his own scheme to create a new artifact that allows you to swap things. Really nicely played little moment there of like, oh, okay, he did have a plan. Cool. And I just didn't feel like we had that sort of like cleverness in that whole 60% of the middle. It was just this grind of next quest, next quest, next quest, without the wit and cleverness to it. And that moment, it kind of came back around. And then the final reveal in the last chapter, as he's talking, and he talks about the splitting of the 2 realities of the person, the living and the digital, and however it was said, the virtual. And you realize what we've been listening to in each of these books is digital. Parzival is like, that's a really clever, fun way to close this out that ties back to something in the early chapters and gives us a nice send-off. I was like, that, well played. That was nicely handled. But as I said, I really don't think that this story came together on the whole. And right out of the gate, the beginning section, when it's kind of like why these two characters broke up, this technology is kind of feels a little bit like a slog. Once again, even at the beginning where there's some interesting ideas because you're showing how immature our hero is. And then when we get into the quest, it's not really a character arc for him. It's just the thing that he has to do. So why does this one, like even the messaging at the end, not come together? So you make this gigantic point early on about how they should not use this technology that locks into people's brains. It can be dangerous, all sorts of stuff. And all of them say, yes, do it. And they're just flippant about it. They don't see the concerns. And one of them's like, no, don't do it. This is going to be really dangerous. And then we get this, the worst case scenario happens. Everyone could die. Almost everyone does die. Like we're within 10 minutes of everyone dying, failing, all this stuff. But then it tries to, in the final moments, have Ogg's wife be like, no, the only reason this happened was because that Holiday messed with that one's mind. That's the only issue. And therefore they're like, oh, well then it is okay. It is safe. And it just shrugs off the fact that you never think that we made a mistake. You never think that there's going to be this hiccup that's going to cause chaos. Holiday didn't think deleting the memories was going to cause the chaos. They didn't think putting these things out there would threaten people. You never see the things that's going to cause catastrophe. So you can't just have a line of dialogue from someone saying, no, it's okay. The only reason that happens is because this one, we're perfectly fine. That's the hubris. That's the pride that got them in this situation, thinking that you know everything, that you have control of this. That's what got them in the problem in the first place. You can't just say, well, we're not going to do that because we're not going to do that one thing, because you don't know what the next problem is going to be. And beyond that, let's just even the idea that they almost got everybody killed and they just went, oh, well, it's okay because we didn't do that one mistake, so we're fine. We'll just keep going forward. That you have to come up with a better answer than just because. There's nothing else could possibly go wrong. Well, it's not reality. So it's not interesting when you just say, nothing else can possibly go wrong. We're perfectly fine doing this. Beyond that, the whole thing, you're going through this being like, oh, this is really invasive. We're like seeing someone's memories. So something must have happened where they copied her brain or something like that. And that is the reveal that Holiday, without asking her, copied her brain, watched her memories, and then shared it with other people. And as much as the recreated version says that she's okay with that, it just doesn't in any way make it okay. And then beyond that, built into the technology is that they were copying people's brains without their consent, without even knowing they were doing it, and creating these copies. And it tries to use all of this. It's these are great ideas to explore. This is what the book should have been. This exploration of creation of the simulation, artificial reality, people's like the difference between the meat sack and the brain, the soul waves. What if you can detach the two? That's what it really should have been about, and not 75% quest for Easter eggs, but it doesn't do that. So it has to very quickly have answers in the end, and it comes up with this happy ending of like, oh yeah, we'll send them off on a ship and they'll live in their own existence and they're perfect copies. And it doesn't deal with any of the consequences that need to be dealt with. You can't just have one person say, like, I was fine with it and it's okay. It's not okay to copy people. And then it's also doesn't deal with the actual existential ideas being introduced about immortality and living on forever with anything to say about it. And what does this really mean? Is it like that feels like that needs to be explored rather than just being like using it as a period at the end of your book to be like, happy ending, period. They live forever. That's not entirely satisfying. I need a little bit more than that. So there's just a lot of stuff that I like. It got my brain working once we got it. At the beginning, I had my brain working, but I was frustrated how negative it was. And at the end, got my brain working because like there's interesting ideas here, but I don't like where it landed. And then the whole middle section was just tough to get through. So It was really frustrating. Really frustrating because I enjoyed the first one so much, because there were interesting ideas here, but the way it all fit together did not fit together for me. So unfortunately, I did not like this one. Cannot recommend this one. And I want to talk with some people about it, because my wife hasn't read it yet, and I don't know anyone else that has to like process through. What did other people think and feel about it? Because I just felt kind of gross with some of it, and with like it tried to make a happy ending out of a gross situation to me that's very invasive of people's privacy. And so, anyway, yeah. Let me know what you thought down below. Remember, you can get the book for this book that I give a raving review for. You can get it for free down below at that link by signing up for a free trial. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and books too much.